He doesn't belong here. Not in first class. The words came out sharp like a blade, slicing through the cabin's hum of polite chatter and clinking glasses. Anna Peterson, the chief flight attendant, didn't whisper it. She said it with her chin raised, her voice firm, her eyes locked on the young boy standing just past the first-class curtain. Her words weren't just cold. They were public, deliberate. They echoed like a verdict, not based on a boarding pass, but on something else entirely: skin, in that moment. 14-year-old Jason Robinson stood frozen. The luxury of the cabin, soft leather seats, warm gold lighting, and murmured hellos, seemed to dim around him. He clutched his ticket with both hands. Seat 2A, first class, confirmed, earned, paid for. Yet here he was, on trial for daring to sit in a place many decided he didn't look like he belonged. Before we continue, I want to ask, where are you watching this from? Let me know in the comments below. And if this story already has your heart racing, make sure to like, subscribe, and tap that notification bell so you won't miss what happens next. Because trust me, this story's just getting started. It was a crisp autumn morning at Atlanta's Hartsfield-Jackson Airport. Flight 247 to Chicago was fully booked, and first class was already half-filled with sharply dressed executives, quiet readers, and tired travelers sipping espresso from ceramic cups. At the gate, Jason had breezed through check-in, just like any other passenger. He was dressed in a navy blazer, charcoal slacks, and polished loafers. A young man on a mission, his destination, a national tech conference in Chicago, where he was scheduled to present an original coding project that had already caught the attention of a few investors. His father, Brian Robinson, CEO of Horizon Airlines, had given him the ticket as both a reward and a test. "Your mind got you that seat," Brian had said. "Now walk into it like you built the plane." Jason had smiled at that. His father always had a way of wrapping power in poetry, but none of that mattered now. Not to Anna Peterson, not to the woman 2 rows behind her, who clutched her Louis Vuitton bag a little tighter the moment she saw Jason step into the cabin. That woman was Skylar Foster, mid-40s, designer sunglasses indoors, and an air of superiority thick enough to taste. Her son, Jacob White, same age as Jason but slouched with a video game in hand, smirked as his mother leaned toward Anna. "He doesn't look like he belongs here," Skylar said, loudly enough for the row ahead to hear. "Are you sure that seat's correct?" Anna didn't ask for Jacob's ticket, didn't question Skylar's presence, but she turned to Jason and said, "I'm going to need to see that again." Jason handed it over, calm but firm. "It's 2A, he said. "First class." Anna squinted at it, then looked him up and down, her lips curled just slightly. "You sure this wasn't issued by mistake?" Jason felt his stomach tighten. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. His name, the seat number, and the barcode all matched. But Anna wasn't done. She stepped back, pressed the intercom, and said something Jason couldn't fully hear, except for the words security and passenger discrepancy. Lincoln West arrived within 2 minutes. Uniform crisp, posture tight, eyes already suspicious. He didn't greet Jason, didn't ask a question, just said, "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step out of the cabin while we sort this out." Jason stood still. "I have a valid ticket," he said, "and I haven't done anything wrong." Skylar scoffed behind him. "Of course not," she said, with a sneer, "always playing the victim." That's when Camilla Gray sat up, row 3C, a black woman in her late 20s, wearing simple jeans and a teacher's lanyard. She had watched everything. She stood. "You didn't check anyone else's ticket," she said, her voice calm but cutting. "You only stopped him. Why?" Anna glanced at her, then looked away. Lincoln gestured again. "Let's take this outside, sir." Jason, jaw tight, stepped back through the curtain. Behind him, whispers buzzed like static. No one else spoke. No one else stood. Only Camilla remained upright, her hands trembling, eyes burning, in her chest. Memories of her own childhood echoed, of slights, of glances, of doors closed quietly with no explanation. At the edge of the jetway, Jason stood alone with Lincoln. The security officer looked at him like a hallway monitor catching a kid without a pass. "What were you doing up there?" he asked. Jason's voice didn't shake. "I was sitting in the seat I paid for." Lincoln shook his head. "You got ID?" Jason nodded. "In my backpack. In the overhead bin you just removed me from." Silence. Then Lincoln radioed something in. Jason pulled out his phone, started recording. "I'm documenting this," he said, "for my safety." Lincoln didn't like that. "You want to escalate this?" he snapped. "You want to be detained?" Jason didn't blink. "I want to be treated like any other passenger." Back inside, Violet Gonzalez, a young rookie flight attendant, stood frozen near the service galley. She had watched the scene unfold, unsure whether to speak. She looked over at the cockpit and quietly stepped forward. "Captain," she whispered, "something's not right." Captain Nathan Allen, gray-haired and steady, glanced up from the flight log. "What's going on?" Violet hesitated. "A boy was removed from first class. His name is Jason Robinson, and I think it was because of how he looks." Nathan raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" Violet nodded. "I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but I don't think it was fair." Nathan's face darkened. "All right. Let me see the manifest." Back in the jetway, Jason's phone buzzed. He looked down. A single text sent. 4 words. "Dad, they kicked me." On the other side of the terminal, in the exclusive Horizon Executive Lounge, Brian Robinson looked down at his phone. The world stopped. His fingers clenched the screen. He stood up without a word. Justin, his assistant, looked up in surprise. "Sir?" Brian's eyes didn't move. "Gate 47, he said. "Now." His voice was calm, but inside him, a storm had begun to rise, and as Jason stood outside the plane, ticket still in hand, the intercom inside the aircraft crackled. "Flight 247 to Chicago, now experiencing an unexpected delay. We appreciate your patience." But patience was the last thing this flight was about to see. Jason stood in the jetway, still gripping his phone. The words, "Dad, they kicked me," burning on the screen. His chest tightened, not just from the humiliation, but from the sheer absurdity of it all. That despite doing everything right, being polite, respectful, dressed in his best, with a confirmed boarding pass in hand, he was still being treated like a threat. Lincoln West paced a few steps away, his security badge catching the light as he radioed someone from dispatch. "Yeah," he muttered. "Possible fraudulent ticket. Young male, mid-teens. We're sorting it out." Jason didn't look up, but he heard every word. "Fraudulent," he repeated, barely loud enough for himself to hear. There was no apology, no recheck, just assumption, just judgment. Anna appeared in the doorway again, arms folded, standing like a gatekeeper. "You understand this is standard protocol," she said flatly, as if repeating a line she'd rehearsed. Jason lifted his head and stared directly at her. "Then why wasn't anyone else removed?" Anna stiffened. "Your ticket flagged our system," she said quickly, avoiding eye contact, but before she could continue, another voice rose behind her, this one louder, sharper. "You didn't ask for my ticket," Camilla Gray said, stepping into view from inside the cabin. "Or his," she added, pointing to an older white man now ducking his head. "Or hers," motioning toward a woman sipping champagne. "You went straight to him. Why?" Anna's nostrils flared. "This isn't about race," she snapped. "It's about procedure." Camilla didn't back down. Then why did the procedure start the moment a black kid took a first-class seat? Passengers nearby began murmuring. Some turned their heads away, pretending not to hear. Others exchanged uneasy glances. One man reached for his phone, recording discreetly behind a newspaper. Violet Gonzalez, still near the front of the cabin, looked between Anna and Camilla, her conscience screaming louder than her training manual. She took a shaky breath and stepped toward the cockpit again. "Captain," she said more firmly this time. "Please, we need you." Inside, Captain Nathan Allen set down his checklist. Violet's face was pale but determined. "Something happened, and I think we're making a mistake." Nathan adjusted his headset. "Go on." Violet explained what she saw, how Jason had shown his ticket, how Anna had dismissed it, how Skylar Foster's comment had seemed to fuel the entire encounter. Nathan's brow furrowed. "Did you confirm the manifest?" She nodded. "Seat 2A, Jason Robinson. Everything matches." Nathan rose from his seat. "I want to see this for myself." Back in the jetway, Jason had pulled his phone out again. "I'm being denied access to my confirmed seat," he said aloud, filming Lincoln and Anna from a respectful distance. "No explanation, just told I don't belong. My name is Jason Robinson. This is Horizon Airlines, Flight 247 to Chicago." Lincoln's jaw clenched. "Shut that off," he said. Stepping forward, Jason didn't move. "I'm allowed to record. I'm not interfering. I just want proof of what's happening." "I said turn it off," Lincoln snapped, reaching toward Jason's hand. That's when Camilla stepped between them. "You don't get to grab him," she said, eyes narrowed. "Not for this. Not today." Lincoln stepped back, frustrated. "This is getting out of hand," he muttered. "You're the one making it worse." Camilla shot back. "And so is she," pointing at Anna, who was now visibly flustered. "He's a child, with a ticket, that none of you even tried to verify before throwing him out." Anna's voice cracked as she responded. "We were following procedure, ma'am." "Then your procedure is broken," Camilla said simply, "and everyone here sees it." Inside the terminal, a few more passengers approached the gate to watch. A mother whispered to her daughter. An elderly man leaned closer to listen. Jason, still holding his phone, sent another text to his dad. "They're saying it's a fake ticket." 10 seconds later, his phone buzzed back. "Stay where you are. I'm coming." It was short, calm, but Jason felt a chill. He'd never seen his father angry in public, never heard him raise his voice, but he'd also never needed him like this. He looked up, past Lincoln, past Anna, to the terminal hallway stretching toward the premium lounge, somewhere down that corridor. His father was walking toward him, and the air was about to change. Back on the plane, Skylar Foster leaned toward her son, her voice hushed but venomous. "Don't worry, sweetheart. He'll be flying coach soon enough." Jacob laughed under his breath, not fully understanding, just enjoying the drama. Violet heard her and turned, frowning. "Excuse me," she said, trying to maintain professionalism. "Please lower your voice. The situation is being addressed." Skylar rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. I'm just concerned for our safety." Violet blinked. "He's a child, not a threat." Skylar raised an eyebrow. "That remains to be seen." Violet bit her tongue and walked away. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. This wasn't just about one passenger. It was about all the ones who thought their money bought them the right to treat others like trash. She headed back to the front, praying someone, anyone, would make this right. And then it happened. The sound of firm footsteps echoed down the terminal. Passengers turned. A man in a sharp charcoal suit, eyes locked, jaw set, moved through the crowd like a current through water. Brian Robinson wasn't the tallest in the terminal, but the energy around him shifted as he passed. People moved aside, Justin, his assistant, trailed behind, trying to keep pace. Brian didn't say a word. Didn't need to. When he reached gate 47, he stopped. His eyes swept across the scene, Jason in the jetway, Camilla by his side, Lincoln standing like a schoolboy caught in the wrong, Anna frozen mid-sentence, Skylar watching smugly from the cabin. And then Brian spoke, not with anger, but with precision. "What exactly is going on here with my son?" Anna blinked, as if she hadn't heard. Lincoln turned pale. Camilla smiled softly. Jason's lips parted, but no sound came out. The silence that followed felt heavier than noise, because for the first time that morning, power had just shifted, and the reckoning had begun. Brian Robinson didn't need to raise his voice. The moment he stepped fully into the gate area, his presence alone silenced the room. Every eye shifted toward him, some with curiosity, others with dread, but no one, not Anna, not Lincoln, not Skylar, could look away. Jason stood just behind Camilla, his eyes wide as his father approached, suit crisp, gaze unwavering. Lincoln instinctively stepped back, as if some part of him had already realized what was coming. Anna tried to collect herself, quickly smoothing her uniform and clearing her throat. "Sir," she began, her voice unusually soft. "This situation is under control. The passenger's ticket appeared to be—" "That passenger," Brian interrupted, gesturing toward Jason without turning his head, "is my son." The words dropped into the air like a gavel striking hardwood. Audible gasps followed. Anna's mouth fell open, then shut again. Her composure cracked. Skylar stiffened in her seat, while Jacob's face drained of its smug amusement. Lincoln blinked, then glanced sideways, suddenly unsure where to stand. Camilla, arms folded, allowed herself a quiet smile of satisfaction. Jason, who had been holding in every emotion since being escorted out, looked at his father not just with relief, but with renewed dignity. He had held his ground, and now, the ground was shifting. Brian stepped forward, speaking with the clarity of a man used to command, not because of arrogance, but because of earned authority. "I received a message from my son," he said to no one and everyone. "He told me he was removed from his seat. Seat 2A, a confirmed first-class seat that I personally purchased for him. And yet, instead of being welcomed, he was interrogated, humiliated, threatened." He turned slowly to Anna, whose face had gone a shade paler. "Can you explain why?" Anna's lips parted, but the words didn't come easily. "Sir, I believe the ticket was flagged. There was a discrepancy in the system. It's not uncommon for—" "Was the ticket scanned?" Brian asked. "Yes, but—" "Was his name on the manifest?" "Yes. However, did he cause a disturbance?" "No, but—" "Then why was he removed?" Brian's tone was still level, but the weight of each question was impossible to dodge. Anna hesitated, then said the quiet part almost out loud. I didn't recognize him." Brian stepped closer. "Did you recognize everyone else in first class?" A long pause. "No." "Then what made my son stand out?" Anna didn't answer. She didn't have to. The silence told the truth louder than words ever could. Skylar, watching from her seat, called out with forced confidence. "With all due respect, Mr. Robinson, perhaps you're overreacting. We were all just trying to follow procedure. I merely pointed out a concern, and the staff responded appropriately." Brian turned to her slowly, his voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Mrs. Foster," she replied, tilting her chin. "Skylar Foster." "Mrs. Foster," Brian repeated, nodding slightly. "And what exactly was your concern?" Skylar crossed her arms. "Well, to be frank, he didn't exactly look like someone traveling first class. That's not a crime to notice." "No," Brian replied, his voice tightening. But acting on that assumption, especially when it results in public humiliation, is a problem, a very big one. Especially when you wield influence over the staff with passive remarks and whispered accusations. Schuyler opened her mouth, but Brian raised a hand. Don't explain. Just listen. Because this is going to have consequences. At that moment, Captain Nathan Allen emerged from the cockpit and approached the gate, his face tense. He made eye contact with Violet, who nodded slightly. Brian turned to greet him. Captain, he said, are you aware of what's happened here? Nathan nodded, then looked directly at Jason. I was just made aware. And for what it's worth, young man, I apologize. We should have caught this before it escalated. Jason nodded, saying nothing. His father's presence was speaking for him now, but the ache of what had already occurred still clung to him. Nathan looked to Brian. I've verified the manifest. The ticket was valid. No red flags. There's no reason he shouldn't have been seated in 2A. This was a misjudgment, and a serious one. Brian exhaled slowly, then looked to Lincoln. Your security, correct? Lincoln nodded. Yes, sir. Do you understand who I am? Lincoln's throat moved as he swallowed. Yes, sir. Then you should understand that you don't lay hands on a minor passenger without verifying facts. My son complied. He showed his ticket. He was polite, and yet you removed him without cause. That is unacceptable. I was following orders from the flight crew. Lincoln replied quickly. You followed the wrong ones. Brian snapped. And you didn't stop to think, did you? You didn't stop to ask whether it made sense. You just moved him out of sight like a problem to be handled. Brian shook his head. No more. At that moment, Camilla stepped forward, her voice clear. Mr. Robinson, she said, if I may. This entire cabin saw it. He didn't do a thing wrong. He walked in, showed his ticket, and sat down. That was it. The only thing that made him stand out was his skin. Brian nodded slowly, deeply appreciating the witness, though the weight of it hurt. Thank you, Ms. Gray. Camilla Gray. I'm a teacher, she said. And I teach my kids that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. I wasn't about to stay silent today. Brian looked her in the eye and said, You've done more than speak. You've helped this flight start to heal. Behind them, murmurs of agreement stirred. Several passengers, moved by Camilla's words and Brian's calm authority, began speaking quietly to each other. Some recorded the scene. Others stepped aside to give Jason space as he re-entered the gate area. Brian took one last look around the cabin, then back at Anna. I'm grounding this flight until a full review is completed, he said, effective immediately. Sir, you don't have that authority. Anna blurted. Brian looked her square in the face. I'm the CEO of Horizon Airlines. I not only have that authority, I am that authority. He turned to Justin. Contact operations. Pull a standby crew for cabin lead and gate security. These two, he gestured to Anna and Lincoln, are relieved of duty effective now. The terminal erupted into whispers, some stunned, others affirming. Anna's mouth opened and closed again. Lincoln stepped back and removed his badge. Schuyler said nothing, though her face had turned the color of ash. Jason stood beside his father, no longer the boy they'd removed, but the young man they could no longer ignore. For a moment, the entire terminal felt suspended in silence, like the calm before a thunderstorm. Anna Peterson stood frozen beside Lincoln West, the weight of her dismissal sinking in, but her pride wasn't ready to let go. You're making a mistake, she said, her voice lower now, but laced with stubbornness. I've been with Horizon Airlines for over 25 years. I've followed every policy, every protocol, and in that time, Brian Robinson cut in sharply. How many passengers have you judged before checking a manifest? How many people have you pushed aside because of how they looked? Not what was printed on their ticket? Anna didn't respond, but her clenched jaw said enough. Across the gate. Skylar Foster stood slowly, her arms crossed, feigning dignity. You can't punish her for doing her job. She was protecting the standards of first class, she said, her voice rising. Some of us pay for quality, and we have a right to feel safe. That was the moment Jason stepped forward. His voice was clear, calm, controlled, but behind it was a strength far beyond his years. Safe? He said, looking straight at Skylar. What made you feel unsafe? Was it my blazer, my ticket, or my face? Skylar's mouth opened, but nothing came out. Jason didn't wait. He turned to face the crowd. I came here to fly to Chicago, to attend a conference where I'm supposed to present a project I built on my own, a project that got national attention. I didn't ask for special treatment. I didn't raise my voice. I followed every rule, but I was still told, in front of everyone, that I didn't belong, and you know why. His voice trembled for a second, but he steadied himself. You didn't need to say it out loud. You said it with your eyes, with your tone, with the way you called security before checking my name. Jason paused, and in that moment, every person watching him saw not a boy, but a young man rising. The worst part isn't being embarrassed, he continued. It's knowing how normal this is, that if I didn't have the father I have, if he wasn't the CEO, I'd still be standing out there, or worse, sitting somewhere in the back of the plane, wondering if I even deserved to speak up. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the flight crew behind the service counter stopped typing. Jacob White, who had been so eager to mock Jason earlier, now sat staring at the floor, his foot nervously tapping. Violet Gonzalez, standing to the side, blinked back tears. Camilla Gray put a hand over her heart, and Nathan Allen, the captain who had spent years balancing between management and crew politics, finally stepped forward with the weight of a leader. Jason, he said gently, you're right. We failed you. I failed you. And I apologize. As a captain, and as a man, you deserved better than this. He turned to Brian. Mr. Robinson, I want to personally offer my full cooperation in whatever action you choose. This flight doesn't take off unless we can promise it will be different from this moment forward. Brian gave a single nod, then looked at Justin. Make it official. Ground this crew. Bring in a standby lead and temporary gate security. Justin pulled out his tablet and stepped aside to call operations. Brian then turned to Violet. You've been watching. You've been thinking. You've been brave enough to speak up. Are you ready to lead this cabin for the rest of the flight? Violet's eyes widened, but she stood tall. Yes, sir. I'm ready. Brian nodded once. Good. Make sure my son is treated with the same dignity you would offer any passenger. No more, no less. Because that's the standard we should expect at Horizon Airlines. Always. Meanwhile, Skylar bristled. I don't appreciate being accused or lumped in with whatever this is. She gestured vaguely at Jason and Camilla. I spoke my opinion, and I'm entitled to that. Brian stepped forward. This time not as an executive, but as a father. You're entitled to an opinion, he said evenly. But when your opinion helps humiliate a child who's done nothing wrong, and when you use your voice to question someone's place based on your comfort, that's not just an opinion, that's bias. And you'll need to live with the consequences of that. He looked to Jacob. You're young. You're watching how adults act. I hope you remember this moment and choose better than the example you were given. Jacob met Brian's gaze, and for the first time, he didn't smirk. He nodded. Barely. But it was there. Camilla, moved by the shift, turned to Jason. You changed the room, she whispered. Jason gave a small smile. I just said what needed to be said. That's leadership, she replied. Brian placed a hand on Jason's shoulder. Son, what you did just now, that's braver than anything I've done in a boardroom, and I've done a lot. Jason smiled but said nothing. There was still so much to process. But for the first time since he was pulled from the cabin, he felt not just seen, but understood. Captain Nathan turned to the waiting passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced, we will be experiencing a delay as we recrew the flight. I thank you for your patience and your attention to what has just occurred. We are committed to doing better. Today is where that starts. Applause broke out. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. A slow, deliberate acknowledgement that something had shifted. Not just in policy, but in people. As the replacement staff began arriving, Violet received her updated assignment from operations. Justin gave her a supportive nod. You've got this. She smiled. I'm not just doing this for Horizon, she said. I'm doing it for Jason. Skylar and Jacob were allowed to remain on the flight, not out of forgiveness, but because Brian believed in confronting ignorance with truth, not exile, but as they reboarded. Skylar walked silently, her posture stiff. Jacob glanced at Jason, paused, and said quietly, I'm sorry. It wasn't much, but it was something. And Jason, always his father's son, nodded once. Thank you. As the cabin filled again, the energy felt different, not perfect, but changed. And in the air that followed, a question lingered, not just for the crew or the passengers, but for everyone watching the story unfold. What kind of world do we want at 3,000 feet? And what are we willing to do to get there? As the flight crew shift took place and the gate filled with murmurs of disbelief and quiet applause, Anna Peterson stood to the side of the jetway, eyes sharp, arms crossed, mouth drawn into a bitter line, stripped of her authority, stripped of her uniform's assumed power. She was no longer the voice passengers obeyed. She was the example being removed, and she wasn't going quietly. You'll hear from my union, she snapped, stepping toward Brian with her badge clutched in one fist. You can't fire me for doing my job. I followed airline protocol. Brian turned to face her, his expression calm, unmoved. Anna, he said, voice like steel wrapped in velvet. You weren't fired for doing your job. You were removed for doing it with prejudice, for using protocol as a shield for personal bias, and for making a decision that publicly humiliated a child. Anna's lip trembled, not from remorse, but from fury. I've served this airline longer than you've been CEO. I've seen more entitled passengers than you can imagine. I know what first class is supposed to look like. He didn't fit the profile. That was it. The mask slipping completely. Her words, unfiltered and sharp, echoing into the air like a confession. And in that moment, whatever defense she might have clung to evaporated. Lincoln West stood nearby, awkwardly silent, now fully aware that no one was coming to defend him. His earpiece crackled, and he removed it without a word. Justin Martin approached, holding a clipboard from operations. You've both been officially relieved pending internal investigation, he said professionally, offering no smile, no sympathy. You can wait here for a representative or leave the terminal, your choice. But this incident is now part of a formal record. Lincoln nodded once and backed away, his bravado gone. Anna turned and stormed off toward the staff hallway, her departure unnoticed by most and remembered by everyone. Meanwhile, Skylar Foster was doing her own kind of damage, reboarded in first class. She moved like royalty denied her crown, tossing glances of disdain at other passengers and whispering into her phone with dramatic flair. Yes, it's ridiculous, she muttered loudly enough for others to hear. The CEO's throwing his weight around, the staff's terrified of him, and now the entire flight's been delayed over some sob story. She turned to a woman seated beside her and said, It's all PR. He's just grandstanding. But her words, once effective in boardrooms and brunch tables, now landed with a hollow thud. The woman beside her, a silver-haired grandmother with reading glasses, didn't even respond, just turned away. The court of public opinion had shifted, and Schuyler was no longer in control. In the rear galley, Violet Gonzalez reviewed her notes, adjusted her uniform, and took a deep breath. She was now acting chief flight attendant, a position she never expected to hold, especially not under these circumstances. But the responsibility didn't frighten her, it focused her. She walked the length of the first-class cabin with quiet confidence, checking passenger names, greeting each with respect, and stopping at seat 2A. "Mr. Robinson," she said, with a soft but steady voice. "We're honored to have you aboard. If there's anything you need, anything, you let me know." Jason nodded, his voice low. "Thank you for standing up earlier." Violet smiled. "You stood up first. I just followed." In coach, Camilla Gray sat beside a college student who had recorded the confrontation on his phone. "You uploading that?" she asked. He nodded. "Already done. People need to see this." Camilla exhaled. "I'm a teacher. I'm used to watching kids get overlooked. But this was different. He was doing everything right. And still," her voice trailed off. "I've seen what happens when no one says anything," the student replied. "Not this time." Around them, other passengers whispered, not in gossip, but in quiet reflection. An elderly man mentioned how his grandson had been followed around a store for wearing a hoodie. A middle-aged woman nodded, saying, "It's not just the police. It's everywhere, even at 30,000 feet. For the first time, it felt like people were beginning to connect the dots, that this wasn't an isolated event, but a symptom of something bigger. Back near the gate, Justin finished his final report and returned to Brian, who stood by the jet bridge entrance, arms folded. "Crew's been reassigned. Captain Allen's in full cooperation. Flight's cleared to depart." Brian nodded but remained still. "What's on your mind?" Justin asked. Brian looked out the window, watching a plane taxi down the runway. "I've spent my whole career building this airline," he said. "I fought to get into boardrooms where I was the only face like mine. I told myself change would come with time and policy. But I just watched my son get stripped of his dignity in front of strangers, by people wearing our uniform." Justin's voice lowered. "And yet you're still standing, still leading." Brian turned toward him. "Because I have to. Because he needs to see me fight for him. And because if we don't set the standard now, someone else will set it for us." He looked toward the gate. No more shadows. No more silence. As boarding resumed, Jason looked out the window from his seat in 2A. Watching ramp agents load luggage below, he thought about everything that had just happened. Not just the shame, but the voices that rose with his Violet, Camilla, even Captain Allen, people who didn't have to speak, but did. People who reminded him he wasn't alone. His phone buzzed, a text from his dad. "Proud of you. Be bold in Chicago." Jason smiled faintly, then looked up as a familiar face stepped into the aisle. Jacob White, guided by his mother to their seats nearby. Jason glanced at him. Jacob paused, hesitated, then whispered, I didn't know what she said would cause all that. I just went along." Jason stared for a moment. "Now you do." Jacob nodded quietly. "Sorry," Jason replied. "Be better next time." A simple answer, but the kind that sticks. As the cabin doors closed and the aircraft pushed back from the gate, Captain Nathan Allen came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We acknowledge the delay. We also acknowledge that sometimes doing the right thing takes time. Horizon Airlines is committed to treating every passenger with dignity and fairness. Today was a reminder and a lesson. Thank you for flying with us." A few claps followed, then a few more. Soon. A wave of applause spread through the plane, not out of obligation, but out of shared recognition. In Seat 2A. Jason closed his eyes and exhaled, not in defeat, but in peace. The flight had finally taken off, but something far bigger had just begun. As the engines roared to life and Flight 247 lifted into the sky, the tension that had gripped the aircraft began to ease, not because the incident was forgotten, but because something deeper had shifted. The atmosphere inside the cabin was no longer laced with quiet judgment and false comfort. It was heavier, more thoughtful, but it was also more honest. Jason sat by the window in seat 2A, staring down at the clouds below, his breath finally steady, his posture relaxed but not small. He wasn't shrinking into himself anymore. He wasn't wondering if he should have done something differently. The storm had passed, but he had weathered it, and more than that, he had spoken through it, across from him. Violet Gonzalez made her rounds with the drink cart, her steps more confident than when she first boarded the flight as a rookie. Each passenger she greeted gave her a knowing look, one of quiet respect, of gratitude. A few even whispered, "Thank you." She didn't need a badge to know she'd earned her place. She had stepped into chaos and chosen compassion over silence. That made her a leader, no matter what her title said. In the cockpit, Captain Nathan Allen adjusted the autopilot, then sat back and stared through the windshield into the endless blue. "One flight," he muttered to himself, "and everything feels different." He glanced at the co-pilot, who had been mostly quiet since departure. "Makes you wonder," Nathan continued, "how many other moments we missed by not paying attention, how many other Jasons there were, who never had a CEO for a father." The co-pilot nodded solemnly. "Or someone willing to speak up." Nathan thought of his own kids. He hadn't always done the right thing at the right time. But today, at least, he had the chance to help set a new standard. Back in coach. Camilla Gray was deep in conversation with a few fellow passengers. A grandmother who taught Sunday school, a student who studied political science, and a middle-aged man who managed a logistics company. Together, they shared stories, moments in airports, schools, offices, when someone had been mistreated, questioned, ignored. "What happened back there?" the grandmother said, shaking her head. "It's not new, but it was bold. That boy standing up the way he did? I'll be thinking about that for a long time," the student replied. "It was the first time I saw someone our age say it out loud. Not just record it. Say it. Own it." Camilla nodded. "He reminded us that we all have a voice. The question is whether we use it." Around them, the cabin buzzed not with idle chatter, but with quiet reflection, like a room full of people realizing they were part of something they hadn't fully seen until now. Meanwhile, in first class, Jason pulled out his laptop. The screen lit up with lines of code, a glowing sea of logic and creativity. The project he'd spent months building for the tech conference in Chicago. Camilla had asked him earlier what it was about, and now, with the quiet hum of flight surrounding him, he was ready to share it. He turned to her, seated just a row behind him, and offered a brief explanation. "It's an app that uses voice recognition to help kids with dyslexia read aloud and get real-time feedback." Camilla's eyes lit up. "That's incredible." Jason shrugged modestly. "I just wanted to make something useful. Something that could help people be seen for who they are, not what others assume." She leaned forward. "You already have." The words landed with more weight than she intended, because in this moment, somewhere over Tennessee, 3,000 feet above the ground, Jason Robinson wasn't just a black teenager wrongly ejected from his seat. He was a builder, a speaker, a symbol, and everyone on that plane knew it. Across the aisle, Jacob White shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His mother, Skylar, had gone quiet, no longer whispering accusations or playing victim. She stared out the window, lips tight, phone off. Jacob glanced at Jason's screen, saw the lines of code, the smooth scrolling interface, and finally asked the question that had been tugging at him since before takeoff. "You made that?" Jason turned. There was no hostility in his eyes, just clarity. "Yeah." Jacob paused. "It looks professional. I didn't know you were going to a tech thing." Jason closed his laptop. "You didn't ask." There was silence between them. Then Jacob said, "I believed my mom. I didn't even think to question it." Jason nodded. "Now you know better," Jacob replied quietly. "Yeah, I do." It wasn't friendship, not yet, but it was something honest. And maybe, for boys like them, that was where change could begin. Toward the back of the plane, Justin Martin typed furiously on a company tablet, drafting a full incident report and preparing an internal proposal that Brian had ordered. A sweeping new policy initiative focused on anti-bias training, inclusive leadership, and community storytelling. He paused to glance at the empty seat beside him, once reserved for the security officer who had escorted Jason out. Now, the seat held only a folded blanket and silence. Justin shook his head. "Not on my watch," he whispered. He wasn't just an assistant anymore. He was part of something bigger, in the aisle. Violet made her final rounds before descent, as she passed Brian's seat. He looked up and gave her a genuine nod. "You're doing more than your job today," he said. Violet smiled. "I learned from the best. Your son taught all of us." Brian looked across the cabin to where Jason sat, earbuds in, quietly reviewing his notes. "He taught me too." For all of Brian's achievements, the boardrooms, the balance sheets, the quarterly milestones, nothing had ever made him prouder than the moment his son stood alone in the jetway and refused to let his dignity be taken. As the flight approached final descent, Captain Nathan came over the intercom once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for your patience and understanding. We're beginning our descent into Chicago. On behalf of the crew, we hope this flight wasn't just a journey to a destination, but a reminder of who we are and who we can become when we choose courage over comfort." The words weren't rehearsed. They were real. And for once, passengers didn't just hear them. They felt them. As wheels touched down on the runway and the plane taxied toward the gate, the city of Chicago stretched wide beneath the morning sky. But inside the plane, something even greater had landed. A shift in consciousness, a spark, a question. And Jason, seatbelt fastened, eyes forward, whispered to himself the truth that had carried him through it all. "They tried to move my body, but they couldn't move my voice." The doors of Flight 247 hissed open to the bright, brisk air of Chicago, but as passengers began to disembark, it was clear this wasn't just the end of a routine flight. It was the end of something broken, and the beginning of something bold. News cameras waited beyond the gate, tipped off by passengers who had filmed the incident and shared it online. By the time Jason Robinson stepped into the terminal, flanked by his father and greeted with a quiet nod from Violet, his story had already reached millions. Reporters called his name. But Jason didn't rush. He walked with the calm of someone who had earned every step, every breath, every glance of respect now aimed in his direction. Brian placed a protective hand on his shoulder, but it wasn't to shield him. It was to support him as he stepped into the light. A Horizon Airlines press team guided them to a reserved conference room, where cameras were set up and microphones lined the podium. The room buzzed with reporters, executives, staff, and community leaders. But when Jason approached the mic, the noise faded. What followed was not a press release. It was a testimony. "My name is Jason Robinson," he began, his voice steady but personal. "And 5 hours ago, I was told I didn't belong in first class. Not because of my ticket, not because of my behavior, but because of what I look like." The room was silent. Jason continued. "I was judged by people who had the power to humiliate me, and they used that power, quickly, publicly, and without apology." He paused, scanning the room. "But I'm here today not just because of what they did. I'm here because of what others did next. Because one flight attendant chose courage over silence. Because one passenger stood up instead of looking away. Because a captain decided to listen. And because my father, a black man who had to fight his way to the top of a company, refused to let his son be silenced." Brian lowered his head slightly. Emotion held tight behind his eyes. "This story isn't just mine," Jason said. "It belongs to every kid who's ever been doubted, every person told they were in the wrong seat. And it's proof that when people speak up, things can change." The applause that followed wasn't polite. It was powerful, raw, extended, heartfelt, and as the cameras captured it all, Brian stepped up to the podium, not as the CEO of Horizon Airlines, but as a father and a leader ready to turn pain into purpose. "In the wake of this incident," Brian announced, "Horizon Airlines will be launching a company-wide diversity and accountability program, led by employees, guided by community voices, and built on the truth that equity isn't a PR strategy. It's a promise." He introduced the initiative's leadership team, including Violet Gonzalez, now officially promoted to Chief Training Facilitator for Inclusive Service Culture. She stepped forward, stunned, but confident. "I didn't do anything special," she said modestly. "I just listened to my gut, and I think it's time the industry stopped training us to follow policy and started training us to follow principle." Camilla Gray was also invited to speak. She addressed the crowd not with anger, but with clarity. "I'm a teacher. I tell my students to use their voice, even when it shakes. But today, I saw a young man use his voice with strength most adults don't have. I'm bringing that lesson back to my classroom. Because that's how we break cycles, by turning moments like this into teachable truths." Her words were met with a standing ovation. Reporters crowded the front row, snapping photos and scribbling notes. Jason, seated beside his father, looked down at his phone. Messages were pouring in, from classmates, teachers, even strangers. "You made us proud. You spoke for all of us. Keep going." But the one that made him pause came from someone unexpected. Jacob White. It read, "Thank you. I didn't understand before, but I do now. I told my mom we need to talk. I'm going to try to be better." Jason stared at the screen, then tucked the phone away. Quiet growth was still growth. Later that afternoon, Brian and Jason walked through the terminal together. Side by side, no cameras, no speeches, just father and son. Finally breathing. Brian looked over. "You did more today than most grown men do in their lifetime." Jason shrugged, his expression modest. "I just told the truth." "Exactly," Brian said. "And the truth is what makes people listen." They passed a family seated near the next gate. A little black boy looked up, eyes wide. His mother nudged him, and he smiled shyly. Jason waved. The boy waved back. No words were exchanged, but something had been planted, something lasting. In the weeks that followed, Horizon Airlines saw a ripple effect. Training programs were revamped. Hiring policies were reviewed. A new code of conduct was implemented across all departments. Violet helped write it. Nathan Allen endorsed it. Justin delivered it to the board. And Jason's story? It became part of orientation. New hires watched the video. They heard his speech. They saw what leadership looked like at 14, and it changed them. It reminded them that the smallest voice in the room could hold the biggest truth. Skylar Foster. Meanwhile, returned home to a very different atmosphere. The viral video had exposed her comments, and the backlash was swift. Her social circle shifted. Her influence faded. But more importantly, Jacob had changed. He questioned her now, pushed back, asked why, and when she couldn't answer, he sought better examples elsewhere. She hadn't just lost face. She'd lost the ability to shape her son without resistance. And that, in many ways, was the greatest reckoning of all. As for Jason, his coding presentation in Chicago was a success. Investors showed interest. Educators asked for beta access. But the applause he received that day felt different. Not because of the tech, but because of the courage when he stepped off the stage. A teacher in the front row stood up and said, "That wasn't just a demo, that was a declaration." And Jason smiled, because he knew it was true. He had been tested in public, stripped of dignity, only to reclaim it in front of the very people who tried to take it. But more than that, he'd helped others find theirs. As he boarded the return flight home, passengers recognized him, not with stares, but with nods, with kindness, with respect. Violet greeted him at the door. "Welcome back, Mr. Robinson," she said with a grin. "This time, I made sure everyone knew you belong here." Jason laughed gently. "I always did." He took his seat, not just in first class, but in a new chapter. And as the plane ascended once more, his words from that press conference played back in his mind. "They told me I didn't belong, but they couldn't take my voice." And in that truth, soaring above the clouds, his legacy had already taken flight. Thank you for watching. If this story touched you, please like, subscribe, and share. Your voice matters, just like his.